17 of the fantasy football season with championship week here. Here's a few kickers I have as sleepers this week. The first kicker, Charlie Smythe of the New Orleans Saints. So Charlie Smythe, the last couple weeks, he's coming out of nowhere. Where they signed him about a month ago was this New Orleans Saints team after cutting Blake Rupp, where he went to the Indianapolis Colts. And Smythe, the last two games, double-digit fantasy points for him. So week 13 in Miami, 5. Week 14 at Tampa, 6. Week 15 versus the Panthers, 10. And week 16 versus the Jets, 20 fantasy points. So this week, a slam dunk matchup at the Tennessee Titans. They give up the 8th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. And Charlie Smythe, last week he had 5 field goals. It was no problem for him. And I know this week it's not going to be an indoor game, which obviously that's always a plus this time of year, especially late in the season where most of these teams are in cold weather climates. So this week at Tennessee, like I said, they're going to get opportunities. The same teams have been playing way better over the last 6 weeks of the season. And Smythe, like I said, 2 games in a row with double-digit fantasy points. And possibly this week, he could be a third next kicker. Andy Brogales to the New England Patriots. Brogales out there in 81% of fantasy leagues. And you would think he would have been owned in more fantasy leagues as Brogales, where he's on one of the better teams in the league, one of the more high-powered offenses in the league. And this week, he's got a slam dunk matchup at the New York Jets that give up the most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So the last 4 out of 5 games, double-digit fantasy points, it's been for Brogales. And going back to week 11 versus the Jet team on that Thursday night, 10 fantasy points. Week 12 at the Bengals, 17. Week 13 versus the Giants, 15. Week 15 versus the Bills, 7. And week 16 at Baltimore, 10 fantasy points. So like I said, I expect New England to be in the red zone early and often in this game. I know New York, the weather this time of year obviously not ideal, especially in MetLife Stadium where there's a lot of wind usually over there. But Brogales, he's pretty much been perfect this season. He's kicking the football well, and he's on a New England Patriot team that, you know, obviously they're going to get their scoring opportunities in this game. And this week, I think Brogales, it wouldn't be surprising, anywhere from 8 to 10 fantasy points. Once again, in the final kicker, Brandon McManus, Green Bay Packers. So we know this Packer offense has been hit or miss this season. Jordan Love, it does look like he's going to play. He's been practicing since he got concussed in last week's ball game at the Chicago Bears. And McManus, he's been a pretty solid kicker this season for the most part. And now the last 2 games, double-digit fantasy points. Week 14 versus the Bears, 4. Week 15 at Denver, 16. And week 16 at the Bears, 10 fantasy points. So this week, a good matchup on paper versus the Baltimore Ravens that give up the 4th most fantasy points. And he's been a solid kicker this season at home as well. He's Brandon McManus in Lambeau Field. So we know this offense, they stall out at times where they have to settle for field goals. And McManus, he's used to the cold weather, going back to his days with the Denver Broncos. So this week in a matchup versus a middle-of-the-pack Baltimore defense that is vulnerable, giving up points to kickers on the season. He's a good sleeper option this week. So that's a few kickers. I have his sleepers for week 17 of the fantasy football season.